Welcome back, guys, to Blackout War Stories. Before we start the video, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Thank you. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, February 9th, 2013, 02:16 hours. I was on third shift patrol with Sergeant Ellis. Quiet night, cold, visibility about 70 yards. The Missouri River fog had rolled in low, cutting off the lights from the prison complex across the field. We were covering the northern sector near the old chapel site, a training area that bordered the restricted historic zone. Command wanted it checked after a motion sensor tripped 3 times in less than a minute. The camera feed showed movement near the old foundations, but the frame kept glitching, like a bad signal. Ellis thought it was a coyote. I didn't argue. We parked by the perimeter fence, logged our position, and stepped out. The air was dead still. Even the usual hum from the training range was gone. As I swept my light across the ruins, I saw something in the corner of my eye movement that didn't match the beam's direction. A shape, upright, not bending like an animal. I froze and keyed my radio, but it crackled with static. Ellis whispered, "You see that?" I did, and what I saw that night has never appeared in any official report. It started as a simple perimeter check near a forgotten part of the post. I was assigned to the 705th Military Police Battalion, part of the 15th Military Police Brigade. Fort Leavenworth had been my post for 3 years. Most people outside the Army only know it for the prison, the U.S. disciplinary barracks, but the post itself is old, nearly 2 centuries of buildings, tunnels, and ground that has seen every kind of soldier pass through. Our unit's patrol sector covered the northern end. It included the river bluff, the old cemetery, and several unused historic sites. We worked rotating night shifts, 2 vehicles, 4 MPs per shift. The call that night came from our watch desk around 0200. A motion sensor at the edge of the restricted zone, close to the old St. Ignatius Chapel ruins, had been triggered repeatedly. Normally, wildlife set those off, but 3 activations within a minute counted as a response call. Standard procedure was clear: check perimeter, log contact, report findings. If there was damage or breach, call for backup from the 2nd Patrol Unit. That's what we followed every night. Fort Leavenworth's terrain made things tricky. The post sits high above the river, with steep drops on the east side. Fog forms fast there, especially in winter. Radios sometimes lose line of sight with the base repeater because of the elevation. You get used to static, false readings, and signals bouncing off the bluff. That night was no different, except for how long the motion sensor kept flagging movement after we arrived. Before that shift, I had spent the afternoon reviewing the week's incident logs. Nothing unusual. 1 wildlife call, 1 noise complaint from housing, 1 gate alarm reset. The system we used was the same every post had. Grid map, timestamps, coded categories. We joked that Leavenworth was too quiet for a post that held the Army's highest security prisoners. Still, everyone had heard the stories. MPs from older rotations talked about strange sounds around the old chapel foundation. The site dated back to the 1870s, burned down in 1875 and never rebuilt. Some said the ruins were used for training years ago until the area got fenced off. I never gave it thought until that night. Ellis was senior on the shift, calm, methodical. He'd done 2 deployments before Leavenworth, so nothing rattled him. He told me to run the grid check twice before stepping out. We marked the activation point, grid 17 Alpha, just 50 meters south of the fence line. That zone bordered the restricted boundary between the historic district and the active training area. We logged our call sign, Bravo 21, and rolled north past the Museum Road. The post was dark by then. Even the Command and General Staff College buildings were unlit, except for a few security lamps. The only light came from our vehicle headlights cutting through the fog. The roads on post curve in ways that play with depth perception. When you're driving, you can't always tell how far you are from the river or the fence line. That night, we relied on GPS and the grid overlay on our patrol laptop. We parked near the maintenance trail that leads to the chapel ruins. It's not open to anyone but maintenance or security. We left the truck running for warmth and stepped out with lights and radios. I remember how the gravel sounded, too loud in the cold. There was no reason to think anything unusual was waiting for us. It was supposed to be another routine check, 10 minutes at most. But small details didn't line up. The first was the static on both our radios. The second was the faint tone that came through Ellis's headset, like a burst of feedback. We ran a quick comms test with the desk, got partial acknowledgement, and decided to walk the short route to the sensor tower anyway. I had been on that trail before during the day. It cut between the fence and the overgrown foundation stones. The old chapel site sat maybe 30 yards downslope, just visible through the trees when the fog lifted. That night it was only a gray outline. We reached the tower, checked the panel, and found no visible damage. The sensor light blinked steady green. That meant no active detection, but the desk said it was still pinging movement on their screen. We stood there trying to figure out how a motion detector could trip while it read clear on sight. Ellis said, "Probably the system's delay." I nodded, though the timing didn't fit. We waited another minute, then 2. That's when I heard the sound of boots, faint, somewhere behind the fence line inside the restricted zone. Not running, just steady pacing. I thought it was another patrol or a maintenance worker finishing late. I keyed the radio again, tried to reach any nearby units, but got nothing, only static. Ellis shined his light toward the sound. Nothing reflected back. He said, "We'll log it and head in." But before we could turn, the sensor light flashed red again. And this time, both of us saw movement across the fence, clear, upright, and moving in a straight line through terrain. No one could walk without a light. The cold hit harder then. My breath caught. Ellis went still. He muttered, "That's not on the schedule." We stepped closer to the fence to confirm visual contact. That was when I realized the path we took wasn't the same one marked on the base map. When we realized the trail didn't match, Ellis checked the GPS. The system showed our old path missing. The grid marking for 17 Alpha had been removed, replaced by a restricted zone. The fog made it hard to see markers, and the fence looked older here, rusted, with sections that didn't line up with the newer posts. Ellis said it might be part of the old perimeter left from before the renovations. He'd read that certain historic areas had never been fully resurveyed because they bordered protected sites. It made sense. Fort Leavenworth's oldest buildings were still in use, some dating back to the 1800s. Every new structure had to fit around the past. That was one thing about Leavenworth. You could walk through time without realizing it. The southern half of the post had brick quarters from the Civil War era still occupied by officers. The Rookery, a big white house built in 1827, stood near the main road. People called it the oldest continuously occupied building west of the Mississippi. Most saw it as a museum piece, but families actually lived there. Others refused to stay long. Rumors about footsteps and doors opening on their own had circulated for decades, though nothing ever made it into the maintenance logs. The old chapel ruins, where we now stood near, were another story entirely. The St. Ignatius Chapel had burned in the 1870s. No one rebuilt it. Some said the fire was caused by lightning. Others said by faulty lamps left burning overnight. The Army preserved the foundation as a memorial, fencing it off to prevent vandalism. Local tour groups visited during the day, never at night. By the time I got stationed there, most MPs avoided that route unless ordered. They said the area gave false readings on sensors, confused thermal cameras, and messed with radios. The briefing notes always mentioned environmental interference due to proximity to river moisture. That explanation was enough for most people. Ellis and I worked in silence for a while. We followed the fence until we reached a small maintenance shed listed on the site layout. It was locked, untouched. The security tag was intact. The ground around it, though, showed faint prints. Boot-like, maybe a few hours old. Not ours. The soil was firm and cold, which made the imprints distinct. Ellis crouched, looked close, then stood. Could be maintenance, but they should have logged it. He radioed the desk again. Static. He tried the second channel, still static. I switched to the vehicle frequency. Nothing. We walked another 10 yards and saw the same blinking red light on the sensor tower again, though we hadn't reset it. That's when Ellis said something I'd never heard from him before. "This isn't right." We returned to the vehicle to check the laptop feed. The live camera showed our 2 heat signatures, nothing else. But the motion sensor on the system screen still showed active. The desk couldn't be reached, so we logged everything manually. Time, grid, signal duration. Ellis decided to run a perimeter loop before closing the call. We drove toward the old cemetery road that curved behind the ruins. That part of the post had uneven terrain, old stone walls, some from the 19th century. They cast strange shadows under the lights. At the top of the hill, I saw the faint outline of the disciplinary barracks floodlights in the distance. The new prison sat on the north side, high and isolated. Between it and our location were acres of wooded ground and old training fields. It was the quietest sector on post. No housing, no barracks, just patrol routes and sensors. We parked again and stepped out for the perimeter loop. The air was colder and the fog was lifting in patches. I could finally see the outline of the old foundation. Square stone edges, overgrown with grass. A small sign read, "Historic Site, Do Not Enter." Ellis took photos with his duty camera, standard for documentation. I kept scanning the tree line with my light. That's when I noticed how silent the area had become. Even at night, you usually hear insects, distant traffic, or the hum from generators at the training complex. There was none of that now. We finished our sweep, logged it, and prepared to return to the truck. That's when the vehicle's dash lights blinked off for 2 seconds, then came back on. The engine stayed running. Ellis frowned. "Power relay glitch?" "Maybe," I said, but I could see he didn't believe it. Neither did I. We drove back toward the main road. As we cleared the turn, the motion sensor alarm triggered again, same grid, same timestamp pattern as before. Ellis hit the brakes. We stared at the laptop. The system showed motion 50 meters behind us, right where we'd just been. We turned around, headlights off, and waited. The feed flashed, static again, then cleared. The motion stopped. Ellis wrote in the log, "No visual confirmation, no contact. Repeated sensor activation at cleared grid." We stayed there a few minutes longer. Nothing moved, no sound, no light, just fog returning over the ruins. When we finally left, the vehicle camera caught something none of us saw at the time. A faint shape standing by the fence line, half hidden in mist, unmoving. We didn't review that footage until later. At the time, all we knew was that the system kept detecting movement where there was none, and that our route, for some reason, didn't exist on the base map anymore. That was the beginning of what Command later called Incident 17 Alpha. And it wasn't over yet. The next night, Command assigned us to the same patrol sector. No one mentioned the previous incident. The log from 17 Alpha had been marked technical malfunction. I asked Ellis if he filed the footage. He said the desk took it for review, but hadn't logged a copy back to the shift archive. That was unusual. Normally, every recording stayed in our system, no matter how minor the case. We rolled out at 2300 hours. The sky was clear, no fog this time. The river looked calm from the bluff road. It should have been an easy night. At 0023 hours, the desk called in. Same sensor, same grid. Repeated motion detections. Command wanted a live verification before sending maintenance again. Ellis looked at me and said, "Let's end this one clean." We reached the site in under 5 minutes. The ground was dry, no tracks, no wind. The sensor tower light blinked steady green again, meaning no active motion, but the base feed showed it still tripping. Ellis did a full power reset. The system rebooted, stayed quiet for 2 minutes, then the red alert light came on. We both stepped back, expecting maybe a short or ground fault. Instead, the alarm pattern changed. 3 short beeps, pause, 2 long. That was a manual test signal. Someone had to input that from the control box itself. We looked at each other. No one else was on site. The control box was locked, tag seal still intact. Ellis tried the desk again. This time, the radio worked. He reported an unauthorized signal pattern and requested confirmation of any maintenance crew scheduled in that sector. The reply came after 30 seconds. "Negative. No authorized personnel in your grid." We both knew what that meant. Standard protocol said to treat it as a possible breach until proven otherwise. Ellis radioed for the secondary patrol unit to stage near the museum road. We began a slow advance toward the old foundation. The fog had not returned, but the air felt colder than the surrounding area. My breath came out visible even though the truck thermometer read 42 degrees. I stayed 5 meters behind Ellis, scanning both sides. The ground sloped slightly down toward the ruins. Halfway there, the red light from the tower turned off. Then one by one, the perimeter lights along the fence clicked off too, in sequence, like a controlled shutdown. We froze. Total darkness except for our flashlights. Ellis whispered, "Power cut?" I shook my head. The base power grid was redundant. Even a main outage wouldn't sequence like that. We continued forward, lights steady. My beam caught the corner of the foundation wall. Nothing moved, no sound. Then just above the stones, a faint white reflection. I moved closer, and it shifted slightly like a piece of fabric. I thought it was debris, maybe plastic caught on a branch. But when the light centered on it, it vanished. No sound, no motion, just gone. Ellis turned to me. "You saw that?" I nodded. We checked the ground where it had been. Undisturbed soil, no prints, no debris, nothing that could explain the reflection. The radios crackled again, static first, then a faint voice repeating our call sign. It wasn't the desk. The voice sounded distorted, low, almost mechanical. Then silence. Ellis raised the mic. "Repeat transmission." No response. We stayed another 10 minutes. The perimeter lights came back on, all at once. The tower reset itself to standby. Ellis logged everything. I took photos of the tower, fence, and soil. When we got back to the vehicle, the system console displayed an alert. Motion detected, camera unavailable. The timestamp was 0029 hours. That was the exact minute the lights went out. Ellis stared at the screen, then turned the truck around. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. At 0105, he keyed the desk. "Sector clear. Recommend tech inspection at first light command." Logged it as equipment fault again. But we both knew we hadn't been alone out there. 2 nights later, they reassigned our patrol area again. Same sector, same grid. Command said maintenance had inspected the sensors and found no fault. They replaced the control board anyway. The report said, environmental interference possibly caused by high humidity. That explanation didn't match the weather. The air had been dry for 2 days. Ellis didn't argue, but I could tell he didn't buy it either. Neither did I. We started our shift at 2200 hours. The rest of the post was quiet. We made our normal gate checks and housing rounds before heading north. Ellis kept the radio on the secondary channel, avoiding chatter from the desk. He said he wanted a clean feed if anything happened again. By 2330, we were near the ruins. The place looked normal under the headlights, just stone and grass. I scanned with the thermal camera this time. The display showed nothing but cold spots. No heat, no movement. We parked, stepped out, and walked toward the fence. That's when we noticed the air felt different again. Heavy, but not cold this time. It was like walking into a sealed room. No wind, no sound, no echo from our steps. We reached the sensor tower and checked the new panel. The green light was steady. Then the red light flashed once. Only once. A single pulse. Ellis looked at me confused. "You see that?" Before I could answer, the radio picked up a faint sound. Not static, not a voice. Just a low tone, steady and mechanical, like an alarm buried under layers of interference. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then cut out. We reported the tone to the desk. The operator said no alarms were active. All systems showed normal. Ellis asked them to check our grid manually. They confirmed it as clear and quiet. While he was still on the line, I walked along the fence about 10 meters down. I aimed my light toward the trees. That's when I saw movement again. Slow, measured, like a person walking parallel to us, just inside the tree line. I called out, "MP Patrol, identify yourself." No answer. Ellis joined me. We both saw it then, a faint outline, human-sized, pacing between the trees. No uniform detail, no face. Just a dark shape moving in rhythm, like it was keeping pace with us. Ellis keyed his mic. "Possible intruder, grid 17 Alpha, moving east to west, inside restricted zone." The desk replied fast this time. "Negative. No movement detected on cameras." We looked again. The figure was still there. We started moving closer to the fence. I kept my light trained on it. It stopped. Then after 2 seconds, it turned, slowly, and seemed to face our direction. I felt my chest tighten. Ellis whispered, "Stay sharp." The figure didn't move. Ellis raised his light, and in that instant, the radios cut out again. Both units dead. We waited, lights steady, but the figure was gone. We jumped the ditch, reached the tree line, and searched for 5 minutes. No prints, no tracks, nothing disturbed. The ground was too firm for anything to vanish without trace. When our radios came back, Ellis called in a sector secure report, voice calm like nothing happened. I followed his lead. We didn't mention the shape. We just said we checked the perimeter and found no breach. As we walked back to the truck, Ellis said quietly, "We'll let the footage talk this time." The next morning, the recording showed something strange. The video feed from our body cameras went black for exactly 1 minute the same time the radios cut. But the tower log showed continuous function, no loss of power. That gap stayed unexplained. Ellis and I didn't tell anyone what we saw that night. We just logged the time, submitted the report, and signed our names. But from that night on, we both knew something about that sector wasn't ordinary. And the next call we got would prove it. The next week started with a briefing none of us expected. The operations officer called a closed meeting for all MPs on night rotation. He said there had been multiple reports of unexplained sensor activations across 3 northern grids, not just ours. Each incident matched the same time window between 0020 and 0030 hours. He showed us a map with red marks. Every mark was in a straight line running east to west, from the old chapel site toward the river. He said command believed it was a network issue, maybe cross-feed interference from civilian cell towers across the state line. We all nodded, though everyone in the room knew that excuse didn't fit. Fort Leavenworth's systems were isolated and encrypted. Civilian networks couldn't cause that kind of sync. Still, no one argued. After the briefing, Ellis pulled me aside. He told me the footage from our second incident was missing. The desk said it was flagged for review, but the archive entry showed file not found. No reason was given. When he checked the archive number, it showed no file found. The same thing happened with the camera footage from 2 other patrols that week. All missing. We were told to continue patrols as usual. That meant returning to grid 17 Alpha every 3rd night. Our next shift there was on February 16th. The weather had turned cold again, wind from the north, light snow. Visibility was fair. The ground crunched under our boots as we walked the trail. Everything looked the same stones, same fence, same sensor tower blinking green. Ellis carried the thermal scope this time. I handled the logbook and radio. We ran a full scan. Nothing on thermal, no movement, no heat. Then as we circled back toward the truck, the radio beeped twice a priority signal. The desk said, unscheduled activation, same grid, multiple sensors. All reading movement eastbound. We froze. The motion was showing inside the restricted zone again, but this time it wasn't one source, it was 4, moving in formation. Ellis whispered, could be maintenance convoy. Ask if they're tracking it. The desk confirmed negative. No personnel in the area, no vehicles on that side of post. We turned off our lights and waited. The sensors kept tracking, all 4 moving in a straight line toward us. The ground ahead was clear, no sound, no light, no dust. Then the reading stopped. The system reset itself, all clear again. Ellis turned on his flashlight and scanned the fence. That's when he saw it. Faint outlines on the other side. Not solid shapes, more like shadows pressed against the fog. They stood still, shoulder to shoulder, about 10 meters apart. He called out, military police, identify yourselves. No response. The figures didn't move. They didn't shift or fade, just stood there in perfect spacing. I raised my camera and took 3 quick shots. The flash reflected off the fence and came back white. When I looked again, the figures were gone. Ellis walked to the fence line. He scanned with the light, then stopped. There were marks in the frost prints, perfectly shaped, deep, and fresh. They led toward the old foundation, then ended halfway across open ground, no continuation. We followed the line, careful not to step over. The prints just stopped, mid-path, like the people who made them vanished mid-step. Ellis crouched and touched one. The frost had melted where the print was, still warm. He looked at me and said quietly, someone's here. We radioed the desk again. This time no static. The connection was clear, but before we could speak, a voice came through. Not the desk operators. A man's voice, older, calm with a slight echo. It said, do not approach. Then silence. We tried to raise the desk again. The operator confirmed they had not transmitted anything on our channel. We logged the voice, the footprints, and the time. Ellis marked the position on GPS. When we returned to the truck, we checked the system feed again. All cameras had gone black for exactly the minute when we heard the voice. That night, Ellis called it in directly to the operations officer. He was told to file a written report and not discuss it further. The report disappeared within 2 days. A week later, new patrol assignments came down. Our grid was listed inactive for maintenance. But off the record, Ellis told me something I can't forget. He said a classified historical team had come to the post the morning after our last call. They requested access to the same sector we'd patrolled. He overheard that they were documenting subsurface anomalies near the old chapel foundation. No one ever explained what that meant. Whatever it was enough to shut down half the northern perimeter for 2 weeks, and that's when everything started to unravel. When the northern sector reopened, Command said the maintenance team had repaired underground cabling and replaced damaged conduit lines. That was the official explanation. But when Ellis and I got the updated map, the area looked different. The old chapel site was still there, but the grid boundaries had been redrawn. The sensor tower was no longer listed. Instead, there was a blank rectangle marked restricted. Ellis stared at the new map for a long time. Then he folded it and said, "We're going back there." I didn't argue. We both wanted closure. Too many unanswered things. We went off duty at 0600 that morning, then signed out a vehicle from the motor pool under the reason post-perimeter familiarization. It wasn't unusual. MPs often did route checks during shift transitions. We took minimal gear, just flashlights, sidearms, and a handheld radio. The post was quiet at sunrise. The Missouri River glowed faintly under the thin mist. The roads were empty, and the wind carried that sharp winter chill you only feel on Kansas plains. We drove north past the museum road, past the staff housing, until the restricted gate came into view. It was chained and locked with a temporary sign that read "Authorized personnel only." Ellis parked the truck beside the fence. We sat for a while, both watching the trees sway. Then he said, "Something's buried out here." We walked the perimeter slowly. The ground near the ruins looked freshly dug. The soil had been turned and pressed flat again, but you could see the color difference. New earth always gives itself away. There were also tire marks, heavy, wide treads, probably from construction trucks. Ellis pointed to a rectangular patch of disturbed ground about 15 feet long. That's where the tower used to be. We both knelt near it. No wiring, no mount bolts, nothing left. Just clean-filled dirt. I brushed some of it aside and saw a corner of something metallic, small and square. Ellis grabbed his folding knife and scraped gently. It was part of a label plate, the kind used on electrical equipment. The number on it read 17001. That was our old tower's identification. Ellis exhaled slowly. They buried it. We didn't have clearance to dig, so we logged the coordinates. Before leaving, Ellis walked toward the foundation stones again. He stood there for a few seconds, then called me over. I joined him, and that's when I noticed the ground had shifted slightly since our last patrol. Some stones had been moved. In the center of the ruin was a shallow pit, maybe 6 feet across. It looked like it had been reopened and refilled more than once. Someone had been working there. The edges were marked with stakes and twine, like an archaeological dig. Ellis took photos. Then he stepped into the pit, crouched, and ran his hand over the dirt. He froze, his eyes fixed on something half buried. It was a fragment of metal, dark and curved. He pulled it loose. It looked like part of an old canteen, late 19th century. Faint initials read TB. One stake near the pit carried the year 1875, same as the chapel fire record. We thought it was a relic, maybe left over from the old frontier days. But as Ellis held it, I noticed something strange. The surface was warm, not just from his hand, but evenly warm, as if it had absorbed heat. The air temperature was below freezing. He placed it on the ground, and we both stepped back. The warmth faded after a minute. We looked at each other, and he said quietly, "We shouldn't be here." We turned to leave, but before we reached the fence, our radio crackled. The signal came through clear, too clear. A male voice said, "Unit Bravo 2-1, remain at your position." Ellis responded instantly, "Identify yourself." The voice repeated, word for word, the same order. We tried the command desk frequency. No response. The recording later showed the waveform didn't match any base transmission. The voice came from no known source. Everything around us felt still, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement behind the ruins. 3 figures, walking side by side toward the fence. Same pattern, same spacing as before. Ellis drew his sidearm but didn't aim it. He said, "They're walking the same route." We watched in silence as the shapes stopped halfway across the open ground. They were clear this time. Dark uniforms, old-style jackets, round caps. Not modern issue. No insignia, no gear. Just silhouettes in uniforms that didn't exist anymore. Ellis whispered, "That's not possible." The figures stood still, facing us. One of them raised its arms slowly, as if signaling. The radio came alive again, repeating the same order. "Remain at your position." But the voice was our own recording. It was Ellis's voice, word for word, tone for tone, from less than a minute ago. I felt my stomach tighten. Ellis froze. The figures took one more step forward, and the ground near the old foundation trembled slightly, like something deep underground had shifted. The sound was low, more felt than heard. Then the figures were gone. No fade, no blur. 1 second there, the next gone. We stood frozen until the radio went silent. Then Ellis said quietly, "We're leaving." We got back in the truck and drove straight to the desk. We didn't speak the entire way. The only sound was the engine and the rattle of gear in the back. At the desk, Ellis handed the report straight to the operations officer. He didn't explain, just said, "Grid secure. Recommend full lockdown." The officer didn't question him. He just nodded, took the file, and told us to head home. That night, for the first time in years, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same formation, 3 figures standing in the fog, waiting. And deep down, I knew they weren't finished with us yet. The next day, the Post went into what they called a localized restriction. It wasn't a full lockdown, but movement north of the main loop road was limited to authorized vehicles only. Ellis and I were pulled off normal patrols and assigned to administrative duty. No explanation. It was clear they wanted us away from that grid. For 3 days, we processed paperwork, vehicle reports, and shift logs in the operations office. During that time, several equipment trucks rolled through the gate marked restricted. They carried ground-penetrating radar gear in containers labeled geotechnical survey. Civilian contractors escorted by officers we didn't know. No unit patches, no name tapes. Ellis kept watching them through the window. On the 4th morning, he said, "They're not looking for cable lines. They're mapping something under there." That afternoon, a lieutenant colonel from Engineering Command called both of us in. He thanked us for our reports and told us the area was officially under environmental review. He also said all incident notes, photos, and recordings were now classified and to be turned over immediately. We signed the transfer papers and handed everything in. No copies allowed. That evening, Ellis came to my quarters. He looked tired, pale, not like himself. He said, "I can't stop hearing it." I asked what he meant. He said that same voice from the radio kept replaying in his head. His own voice giving the order to remain at position. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. I thought it was stress, but I didn't say that. 2 nights later, the base power flickered across the north grid for 12 seconds. Backup generators kicked in, and the desk logged temporary interference from the river substation. But during that exact window, the motion sensors in the restricted area activated again. Same sequence, east to west, 4 signatures moving in formation. No one was authorized to respond, but command sent a maintenance camera drone. The live feed went static after 30 seconds, then cut out completely. When the signal returned, the drone was sitting on the ground near the ruins, camera pointed upward. The footage showed clear footprints surrounding it. Same spacing, same pattern. At 0400, the engineering team left the site. They loaded sealed containers onto their trucks, covered them with tarps, and left before sunrise. No one said what they found. The next morning, Ellis didn't report for duty. His room was unlocked, his gear still there. The desk called his phone, but there was no answer. His car was parked near the main gate. Later that day, military police from another battalion checked his quarters. It started as a missing person case, then closed within 24 hours. The file read voluntary absence. No public update followed. I didn't believe that. Ellis wasn't the kind of man to walk away. He had 3 months left before rotation. He was steady, responsible, precise. Something happened to him after that last patrol, something no one wanted to put in writing. 2 days later, I was reassigned to a different post in Missouri. No warning, no request, just orders. The transfer happened fast. My last memory of Leavenworth was driving past the north gate at dawn. The restricted area was still fenced off, guarded by temporary security units. Weeks later, out of habit, I checked the post's incident logs online. The grid number 17 Alpha had been removed completely. The surrounding zones were renumbered, as if the old map never existed. Even the old St. Ignatius Chapel site was listed as unavailable under preservation study. Months passed before I could sleep through the night again. I kept thinking about those footprints ending mid-step and the sound under the ground that day. Whatever was beneath that ruin wasn't just history, it was something buried deep enough for the Army to pretend it never happened. Then one night, almost 6 months later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The line was full of static, but I heard breathing, steady and close. Then a voice spoke quietly, just one sentence. "Remain at your position." The line cut before I could speak. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, listening to the empty signal tone. I knew that voice. It was Ellis. That was the last time I ever heard it. The next morning, I checked the call log. No record of any incoming call during that time. Just a blank space between 2:29 and 2:30. After that, I stopped asking questions. But even now, when I drive through quiet bases at night and see motion sensors blinking red in the fog, I remember the line from that ruined chapel, the voice from the radio, and the 3 figures that never showed up on any camera. Whatever happened at Fort Leavenworth didn't end there. It was only contained. After my transfer, I tried to push Fort Leavenworth out of my mind. The Army doesn't leave much time for reflection, and new duty stations keep you busy. Still, certain things never added up. My new assignment had access to shared security archives. I checked the logs from my last post when I could, using the clearance I still held. There was no mention of Grid 17 Alpha, not in any report, maintenance file, or patrol log. It was as if the entire sector had been erased from record. What did remain were administrative gaps. Those always tell the truth. Duty rosters from that month showed equipment issued for North Perimeter maintenance. The problem was, no return entries existed for that gear. 5 sets of ground sensors, 2 thermal cameras, and 3 generators were checked out, but never logged back in. Normally, that would trigger a supply investigation. Here, the entries were sealed. I recognized the code in the remarks section. Refer to command inspection. That meant higher command had claimed jurisdiction. 2 months later, I ran into a former colleague from the same battalion at a training course. He'd stayed behind after my transfer. When I asked about Ellis, he just shook his head. "They closed it," said he went AWOL. I could tell he didn't believe it either. He said the base stopped sending patrols anywhere near the old chapel site. The area had been fenced again, this time with warning signs about unstable ground and structural risk. He told me something else. A week after I left, a small team from Army Historical Command came through. They worked in the area for 3 days, escorted by officers from the Combined Arms Center. They used sonar and mapping equipment, like the engineering crew before them, but under a different designation. They took soil samples and recorded everything on paper, not on digital systems. When they finished, the site was sealed for good. No public notice ever mentioned it. The Post newsletter called it routine preservation of historical landmarks. The tone was casual, the kind you use to bury a story without lying. At my new base, I kept getting brief flashes of that night. The fog, the motion sensors, the voice over the radio. Sometimes, while driving through the motor pool in early morning light, I'd catch myself expecting to see Ellis walking toward me. It never happened. I stopped trying to explain it to anyone. You can't put things like that in a report. A year later, an internal bulletin reached my inbox by mistake. It listed a range of training restrictions across multiple posts, including Leavenworth. The note beside the restriction read, "Ground instability discovered in historical area. Possible subsurface cavity. No personnel access authorized until further notice." It was small, hidden among dozens of entries. But I knew what it meant. They'd found something under that ruin, something deep enough to cause structural concern. It explained the digging, the surveys, the sealed containers. I printed that bulletin and kept it in a folder. I didn't know why at the time. Maybe because it was the first real evidence that something had been buried there, and that command knew it. Over the years, the details of that night faded, but the facts stayed clear. The motion sensors were real. The power cuts were real. The radio transmissions were logged. Those things leave digital traces, even if they're later deleted. Every time I looked at my old patrol log, I saw the same note in the margin of my final entry: environmental interference, unresolved. That phrase covered a lot of things. In this case, it covered what none of us were allowed to describe. I still think about Ellis. I never found any record of his discharge, retirement, or death. His name isn't listed on any personnel separation list from that year. It's like he was written out of the system the same way our grid was. Sometimes late at night, I play back the last audio I have from Fort Leavenworth, the dispatch recording from our final shift. It's mostly static, but there's a faint echo in the background, like distant boots on gravel. When I first noticed it, I thought it was a playback error, but the pattern repeats in perfect rhythm, 4 steps at a time, pause, then 4 again. I've never told anyone that, not because I'm afraid of what they'd say, but because I'm afraid they'd believe me. And once you believe something like that, it stays with you. I never got full closure on what happened at Fort Leavenworth, but small pieces surfaced over the years. One came from a training conference in 2017. A logistics officer from Engineering Command gave a presentation about infrastructure hazards on historic bases. One of his slides listed subsurface heat anomalies under the Kansas section. It wasn't labeled by location, just coordinates that I recognized instantly. They matched the grid where Ellis and I had last stood. I waited until the session ended and asked him casually what kind of anomaly it was. He said it involved residual heat signatures below the frost line that didn't match any known utility routes or natural vents. He added that the Army had sealed the area for safety. I asked if they found a cause. He smiled in that way officers do when they've said too much already and replied, "Old ground sometimes holds energy. We just don't disturb it." Then he walked away. That night, I pulled the coordinates again from memory and overlaid them on a current base map. The grid was gone. The road near the old ruins had been rerouted. The map called it Historic Preservation Zone, and the chapel marker had been removed entirely. Only the cemetery remained nearby, fenced off and quiet. A few months later, I visited Kansas on leave. I drove past the outer perimeter of Fort Leavenworth, close enough to see the distant floodlights. It looked the same at first glance, but the north side had a new barrier wall and an additional checkpoint. I stopped at a gas station outside the main gate and talked to a young MP in uniform. He said he'd only been stationed there 6 months. When I asked if they still patrolled near the old ruins, he gave me a confused look and said, "There's no ruins out there, sir. That area's off limits, environmental zone." He didn't know why. None of them did. I could tell by how fast he changed the subject. Driving away that night, I kept thinking about Ellis and the voice that sounded like his. It still plays in my mind sometimes. That calm order repeated through static. Remain at your position. Maybe it was a recording error. Maybe not. The Army has ways of naming things without admitting what they are. Over time, I learned to live with silence. The Army moved me through other posts, other assignments. I built a life outside of night shifts in cold Kansas fog. But some nights when radio chatter echoes faintly across an open range, I still feel that weight in the air, the moment right before sound disappears. I think about the figures we saw on the other side of the fence, standing shoulder to shoulder in perfect spacing. Uniforms from another century, silent and still. I wonder if they were ever real, or if they were echoes of something the ground itself remembered. What I know for certain is that Fort Leavenworth keeps its history close. Too close. It's a place built on centuries of command, confinement, and unfinished stories. Every brick there carries weight. Every field has seen men vanish into duty and never return home. The file for Incident 17 Alpha will never appear in any archive. The reports were sealed, the evidence buried, and the people involved scattered. But that doesn't mean it's over. History doesn't end when the paper runs out. It just waits for the next person to notice the same noise, the same signal, the same movement in the fog. I left my uniform behind years ago, but some part of me is still on that patrol, standing near the fence, radio in hand, waiting for an answer that will never come. It has been more than 10 years since that night at Fort Leavenworth. I have served in other places, seen other kinds of tension, but nothing ever felt like that small corner of Kansas. Most bases fade from your mind after you leave, yet that one never did. I still remember the smell of the river air, the way fog rolled across the ground, and the feeling that something was always just beyond sight. Time makes you question your own memory. I have replayed every second of that patrol in my head, trying to find the simple answer we missed. Maybe it was electrical interference, or a sensor fault, or the stress of too many quiet nights. The mind fills blanks when it wants sense, but every time I think I've reasoned it away, a detail brings it back. The footprints ending mid-step, the warmth of that canteen piece in sub-freezing air, the voice that copied Ellis's exact words. Those things don't fit into routine explanation. Ellis's absence changed me more than the incident itself. In every unit, there is someone you trust without question. For me, that was him. Steady, precise, never careless. Watching him fade from record taught me how quickly a person can be erased in the system once something doesn't line up with command's version of events. I learned then that the Army keeps its ghosts in files, not graves. Sometimes I drive near Leavenworth when work takes me through Kansas. The post skyline still looks the same. Brick buildings, parade fields, lights on the bluff. But I never cross the gate. You can't go back to a place once you've seen what isn't supposed to exist there. I park near the highway, kill the engine, and listen. Usually it's just wind. Once I thought I heard a radio tone in the distance. The same short, long pattern from that night. It stopped before I could decide if it was real. I've come to accept that I'll never know what happened under that ground. Some things stay buried because someone decided they should. Maybe it was history, maybe something else. All I know is that when the sensors went off and the voices came through, something old was awake beneath that ruin. I tell myself the Army closed that sector for safety, that no one patrols there anymore, that the past has finally been sealed under soil and silence. But on quiet nights when the world feels too still, I can still hear Ellis's voice cutting through the static. Calm, precise, the same tone as that last transmission. Remain at your position, and every time I hear it in my head, I stop whatever I'm doing and listen, because a part of me still believes he's out there, somewhere in that fog, standing watch where the map no longer shows a name. Don't turn off the light now. If the story chilled you, subscribe to Blackout War Stories. And for more horror, the next nightmares are waiting on your screen.